What if one of the first things you say when you arrive in Britain can immediately reveal that you don't actually understand the place you're visiting? To many tourists, Britain looks like one country with one flag, one culture, and one national identity. They arrive in London, see the Union Jack flying above a building, hear a British accent, and assume they've figured it all out. But Britain is far more complicated than that. The United Kingdom is made up of 4 different countries: England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, each with its own history, traditions, cultural identity, and, in some cases, even its own language. And here's where things get interesting. Calling someone from Scotland English, for example, is not just a small geographical mistake. For many people, it's a fundamental misunderstanding of who they are. A visitor might casually say, "I love England," while standing in Edinburgh, Cardiff, or Belfast, without realizing that the person they're speaking to may strongly identify with a completely different nation. The confusion becomes even greater because the words Britain, Great Britain, the United Kingdom, and England are often used interchangeably by outsiders, even though they don't mean exactly the same thing. Great Britain refers to the large island containing England, Scotland, and Wales. The United Kingdom includes those 3 countries, plus Northern Ireland. Britain is often used informally to refer to the United Kingdom, although technically the terms aren't identical. It sounds like a minor detail, but understanding this distinction is the first step toward understanding why Britain can feel like several worlds existing side by side. And the deeper you travel, the more obvious this becomes. Cross the border from England into Scotland, and suddenly the scenery, architecture, accents, traditions, and even the historical stories people tell about themselves can change dramatically. Go to Wales, and you may encounter a country where the Welsh language is visible on signs and heard in everyday life, reminding you that English is not the only language that belongs here. Travel to Northern Ireland, and you'll discover a place whose history and identity are deeply connected to a complicated relationship between Britishness and Irishness. Even within England itself, the differences can be enormous. The culture of a person from Cornwall may feel very different from that of someone from Newcastle, while a visitor from London might have an entirely different experience from someone growing up in Yorkshire or the Lake District. Britain is full of regional identities that outsiders often overlook because they see the country through a single image: red buses, black cabs, royal ceremonies, castles, and rainy streets. But the reality is much more fragmented, and that's precisely what makes it fascinating. The moment you stop thinking of Britain as one uniform place and start seeing it as a collection of nations, regions, cities, and communities with their own personalities, the country begins to make far more sense. And yet, there's another mistake tourists make that can be even more surprising, because even when they know they're in Britain, they often believe they already understand the language. You may have spent years learning English, memorizing vocabulary, practicing grammar, and watching movies with subtitles, only to arrive in Britain and suddenly wonder whether everyone has secretly agreed to speak a completely different language. The first surprise is the accent. British English isn't one accent. It's a massive collection of regional voices that can change dramatically within relatively short distances. The English spoken in London can sound completely different from the English heard in Liverpool, Glasgow, Birmingham, Manchester, Newcastle, or parts of Wales. Sometimes, even native English speakers from different parts of Britain can struggle to understand one another, especially when strong regional accents and local expressions enter the conversation. Then there is the vocabulary. A biscuit isn't necessarily what an American would call a cookie. Crisps are what many Americans call chips, while chips are what Americans usually call fries. A jumper means a sweater. A boot can mean the trunk of a car. And if someone tells you they're knackered, they're not describing a broken object. They're saying they're exhausted. And then there are expressions that seem completely harmless, but carry an entire cultural meaning. If a Brit says something is not bad, they might actually mean it's quite good. If someone says, "You all right?" they may not be asking for a detailed explanation of your emotional state. It's often simply a casual greeting. The problem is that tourists frequently interpret British words literally when the real meaning is hidden in tone, context, and cultural habits. But perhaps the most confusing part isn't the vocabulary or even the accent. It's the way British people often communicate indirectly. Imagine you're visiting someone's home and they ask, Would you like a cup of tea? You might think they're simply offering you a drink. But depending on the situation, the invitation could also be a way of welcoming you, starting a conversation, making you feel comfortable, or even quietly signaling that it's time to sit down and talk about something important. Then there's the famous British tendency to apologize. A person might say sorry when someone else bumps into them, apologize before asking a question, or even say sorry when they're clearly not responsible for what happened. To outsiders, this can seem strangely excessive, but in many everyday interactions, politeness is less about admitting fault and more about maintaining social harmony. The same thing happens with humor. British humor often relies on understatement, irony, sarcasm, and saying the opposite of what you actually mean. Someone could be standing in freezing rain with their umbrella turning inside out and calmly say, "Lovely weather," while everyone understands that the weather is absolutely miserable. If you take every sentence literally, you'll miss half the conversation. And this is where the real lesson begins. To understand Britain, you can't simply learn the words. You have to learn the signals hidden behind them, because once you realize that, you'll start noticing that some of the country's most famous stereotypes, from tea to pubs to punctuality, are also far more complicated than tourists expect. If there is one image that seems to follow Britain everywhere in the world, it is the image of a British person sitting elegantly beside a window, holding a delicate cup of tea while rain falls outside. Tourists arrive expecting tea to be almost a sacred ritual, something that happens at precisely the right time, and perhaps comes with a plate of perfectly arranged sandwiches. But the truth is much more ordinary, and in some ways, much more interesting. Tea is certainly an important part of British culture, but its role is often misunderstood. For many people, offering someone a cup of tea isn't about performing some grand ceremony. It's about creating a moment. Someone has arrived at your house? Put the kettle on. Someone has had a terrible day? Make a cup of tea. A conversation suddenly becomes serious? Tea might appear. A friend drops by unexpectedly. The kettle is probably already being filled. In Britain, tea can be a social language all by itself, a small gesture that says, "Sit down, take a moment, let's talk." And while the stereotypical image of afternoon tea with tiered trays and tiny cakes certainly exists, it is not what most British people are doing every afternoon. For many, the reality is much simpler. A mug of tea in the kitchen, at work, on the sofa, or during a quick break. The tourist who expects an elaborate ceremony may be disappointed, but the traveler who understands the deeper meaning discovers something more subtle. The real British tea tradition isn't necessarily about luxury. It's about comfort, routine, and connection. The same misunderstanding happens with British pubs. Tourists often imagine that every pub is a lively, centuries-old establishment where locals spend their evenings drinking beer and discussing politics beside a roaring fireplace. Some pubs really do look like that, and walking into one can feel like stepping into another century. But British pubs are incredibly diverse. Some are quiet neighborhood spaces where people meet for lunch. Others are packed with football fans on match day. Some specialize in traditional ales, while others feel more like modern restaurants. And then there are pubs where the atmosphere changes completely depending on the time of day. What many visitors don't realize is that the pub has historically been more than a place to drink. For generations, it has functioned as a social meeting point, somewhere people can gather, celebrate, argue, gossip, watch sports, or simply escape the house for a while. Yet, even here, tourists can make mistakes. Walking into a quiet local pub and immediately treating it like a tourist attraction can make you stand out. Sometimes, the best way to experience a British pub is to slow down, observe what the locals are doing, and understand that the place has its own rhythm. You don't have to turn every visit into a drinking experience. Sometimes, ordering a soft drink, finding a corner, and simply absorbing the atmosphere can tell you more about Britain than visiting another famous landmark. And then there is punctuality, another stereotype that sounds simple until you actually experience British social life. Britain has a reputation for being a country where everyone arrives exactly on time, apologizes if they're 30 seconds late, and schedules everything with military precision. But reality is much more nuanced. British people certainly value punctuality in many professional and formal situations, but everyday life is rarely as perfectly synchronized as the stereotype suggests. Trains can be delayed, Buses can disappear from the timetable, meetings can start late, and friends can send you a message saying they're 5 minutes away when they haven't even left yet. The interesting part is that punctuality often depends on context. Being late for a job interview is one thing. Being late to meet friends at a pub is another. The phrase British punctuality tells only half the story. In fact, the deeper cultural pattern is often about consideration. If you're going to be significantly late, you are generally expected to let people know. That small act of communication can matter more than arriving at exactly the scheduled second. So, yes, tea matters. Pubs matter. Being on time often matters. But if you arrive expecting Britain to behave exactly like the stereotype, you'll miss the much more human reality underneath it. For millions of tourists, Britain begins and ends with London. They land at the airport, take the train into the capital, photograph Big Ben, visit Buckingham Palace, ride the London Underground, walk through Piccadilly Circus, and then fly home, believing they've experienced Britain. But imagine visiting Brazil and seeing only São Paulo, or visiting the United States and spending your entire trip in New York City. You would certainly experience something real, but you would never claim to understand the entire country. The same is true of Britain. London is enormous, influential, multicultural, and endlessly fascinating. But it is also its own world. The capital has a pace, atmosphere, and social environment that can feel completely different from other parts of the country. In London, you can walk through neighborhoods where dozens of languages are spoken, encounter restaurants representing almost every corner of the planet, and travel through a city where people are constantly moving. But leave the capital behind, and Britain begins to reveal another side of itself. Suddenly, the pace can change. The landscape opens up. Small towns appear between rolling hills, dramatic coastlines stretch toward the sea, and historic villages seem to exist almost untouched by the frantic rhythm of the capital. The mistake tourists make is assuming that because London is British, everything outside London must simply be a smaller version of it. It isn't. The further you travel, the more the country's regional character becomes impossible to ignore. In the north of England, cities such as Manchester, Liverpool, and Newcastle have their own distinctive identities, shaped by industrial history, music, football, and strong local pride. In the countryside, places like the Lake District offer landscapes that feel almost cinematic, with mountains, lakes, stone villages, and winding roads that seem worlds away from the crowded streets of central London. Travel west, and you encounter Wales, where ancient castles and dramatic landscapes exist alongside a living Welsh cultural identity. Go north into Scotland, and the scenery becomes even more dramatic, from the highlands to remote islands and rugged coastlines. And perhaps the most surprising thing for many tourists is how quickly these changes can happen. Britain may look small on a map compared with many countries, but its cultural contrasts are remarkable. A few hours of travel can take you from one accent to another, from dense urban neighborhoods to almost empty landscapes, from modern city life to places where history seems to be present in every stone wall. There is also a psychological difference between visiting London and experiencing the rest of Britain. In London, tourists often feel like they're moving through a checklist of famous places. The city is designed, in many ways, to be discovered through landmarks. But outside the capital, the experience often becomes less about what you are supposed to see and more about what you happen to encounter. You might enter a small pub because it starts raining, discover a local festival you had never heard of, have a conversation with someone who recommends a village you weren't planning to visit, or take a wrong turn and end up looking at a landscape that wasn't in your itinerary at all. Those unexpected moments can become the memories that stay with you long after the famous attractions fade. And this is perhaps the biggest secret tourists discover when they finally leave London. Britain is not one experience waiting to be completed. It is a collection of experiences, each revealing another layer of the country's identity. But there is still one final mistake that can prevent visitors from truly understanding any of it. The assumption that everyone living in Britain shares the same culture, the same humor, and the same way of seeing the world. Perhaps the biggest mistake a tourist can make in Britain is assuming that there is such a thing as a single British personality. From abroad, the country is often presented through a collection of familiar images: polite people, rainy weather, red buses, royal ceremonies, afternoon tea, historic castles, and perhaps a few men in suits discussing the weather while waiting for a train. But Britain is far too complicated to fit neatly into that picture. A person from Cornwall may have a very different relationship with their regional identity than someone from Yorkshire. Someone from Glasgow may see the world differently from someone who grew up in London. A Welsh speaker in North Wales may have cultural experiences that are completely different from those of someone living in the center of Birmingham. Even within the same city, people can have radically different backgrounds, traditions, accents, and ideas about what it means to be British. This is why tourists sometimes find themselves confused when two people from the same country seem to have completely different opinions about history, politics, traditions, or even what counts as British culture. The answer is simple. Britain has never been one perfectly uniform culture. It is more like a patchwork, stitched together over centuries, with every region adding its own colors, stories, rivalries, traditions, and contradictions. And perhaps nowhere is this more obvious than in the way British people treat their own stereotypes. A tourist might expect everyone to be obsessed with the monarchy, only to meet someone who couldn't care less about royal ceremonies. They might expect everyone to drink tea constantly, only to find someone who prefers coffee. They might expect everyone to love football, only to discover a person who has absolutely no interest in sports. They may even assume that every British person is naturally reserved and polite, only to spend an evening with someone whose humor is loud, sarcastic, brutally honest, and completely unpredictable. The reality is that stereotypes often contain a tiny piece of truth, but they become misleading when treated as universal rules. British people themselves frequently joke about these stereotypes, exaggerate them, or use them to tease one another. A person from one region might make fun of another region's accent. Someone from one city might insist their hometown has the best food, the best football club, or the best people in the entire country. These rivalries may seem ridiculous to an outsider, but they reveal something important. Local identity matters. Sometimes, asking someone where they're from can lead to a much more interesting conversation than simply asking whether they're British. So, if you really want to understand Britain, perhaps the secret is to stop trying to understand it as one single thing. Don't expect every person to behave like the characters you've seen in movies. Don't assume that London represents the entire country. Don't treat tea, pubs, accents, or politeness as simple stereotypes that explain everything. Instead, look for the contradictions. Look at how ancient traditions exist alongside modern, multicultural cities. Notice how different nations share a political union while maintaining powerful individual identities. Pay attention to the humor hidden inside ordinary conversations, the pride people have in their hometowns, and the way history continues to influence everyday life. Because the truth is that tourists don't usually get Britain wrong because they fail to visit enough landmarks. They get it wrong because they arrive expecting the country to explain itself immediately. But Britain doesn't really work that way. The more you explore, the more questions appear. And perhaps that's the real reason people keep coming back, because behind every famous landmark, every strange expression, every quiet village, and every crowded pub is another story waiting to be discovered. The Britain you imagine before you arrive is only the beginning. The Britain you discover when you finally look beyond the stereotypes is far more surprising,